Hello.
Hi, Christina. Hello.
Hello.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started here in just a minute. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's having a wonderful Halloween and enjoying your day, and also having a good start to your week, where I believe we're almost week 9 or week 10 here at TOCC. So we're almost there to the end of the semester, and I hope everyone is being successful and is having a good semester. I want to welcome to everyone to this in-service. Just so you know, this is a service that the Department of Education here at TOCC wanted faculty members to do little presentations throughout the semester and whatnot to kind of provide service here on campus, but also to reach out to our students outside the classroom. So that's kind of what this presentation is for. And the one that I have chosen, because it is Halloween, is the name of it is "The Real Monsters in the World," because I think we look at our world and we usually see it through the lens of what we see on TV with monsters and villains and the like. And I think it's important to always keep in mind that there's much more to our world than meets the eye. I laugh with my wife all the time because she's always asking why I like scary movies and why I get into them. And I go, well, in my years of experience, those scary movies are a lot lightheartedly than the real stuff that goes on in the world. So, and that's kind of the message and kind of what I want to send away today with is understanding, the true nature of people who can hurt us or harm us in some way. So for those who don't know me, I'm Dr. Curtis Peterson. I'm the full-time social and behavioral science faculty here at TOCC. I'm a psychologist, and I have a couple areas of expertise. One area is in identity and loneliness, where I do a lot of research into that area. The other area that I'm interested in is violence and relationships. When I started in the helping fields years and years ago, I started as a shelter manager for a women and children's crisis shelter. And then I ended up working with victims of domestic violence for years. And then I started working with severe female offenders for years. And then I went back to work with families, specifically with children who've been sexually abused. And so I have an interest in the dynamics of violence. I have an interest in knowing the trends and where it comes from. And probably what makes this presentation unique is that when I originally started getting involved in the violence field and whatnot, I took on kind of that Western individualistic approach that there must be something bad about the person, their bad apple. Must be something about their disposition that makes them do evil and awful things. And that was very dissatisfying to me. I mean, it's the basis of our criminal justice system. It's the basis of our medical facility. It's the basis of psychotherapy, but it sees very little success rates. And so when I decided to go on with my graduate work, I decided to take a different approach, and I became a social psychologist, where I study violence from the perspective of a person's situation, where they come from, the people they interact with. And through that, I think we can find a lot more answers to solving the problems of violence and harm in at least here in especially the United States, but across the globe. That this presentation takes to the understanding that it's not about just an evil person. It's about a person that's in a situation that is bound by their upbringing, bound by their socialization, bound by the situation that they're in. And so that's the perspective that we're going to take today. And to do that, I've kind of divided this presentation into two. We're going to define what evil is, And then we're going to talk about two different types of homicides. Homicide that occurs for probably greater than 90% of homicides, where it's a situation in which people are in and it creates some type of aggravation that then leads to some type of homicide. Usually it's a one-time occurrence. Sometimes it can be a trend of violence within a community, such as gang violence. And so we're going to talk about that kind of homicide. And then we're going to talk about psychopathic serial killers. These are individuals who kill more than one place at a time, more than one individual at different places. And I'll go through the definition of that. But we're going to look at what's unique about these individuals that makes them different than people who end up committing homicide for a situational reason more. What is the unique thing about their biology? What's unique about their social upbringing, and the like. And then what we're going to end up with, hopefully by the end, is we'll profile a serial killer to see if you can guess the gender and age and ethnicity and motive of the murderer. So we'll see how good you guys are at crime scene investigation. Okay. If we do have time, I would like to speak a little bit about mass and spree shootings. As everyone knows, especially since Columbine in the late 90s, mass shootings at schools and the like have been on the increase. And I'd like to speak a little bit to that, but that's not going to be the main focus of today's talk on homicide. Maybe we'll reserve a special time to talk about those types of issues at another time. Okay. All right. So I think we're ready to go. Okay, and I do want to just give one warning up front. This presentation does have some graphic images and does talk about some pretty graphic topics. So if you are at home and you have young ones around, please be aware. I would recommend maybe headphones or something like that, and to protect your screen, just as a recommendation, because this presentation does have some pretty graphic images. And the content may not be suitable for young children. Okay, but where should we start? And I want to start with a definition of evil, probably from one of my favorite psychologists, Philip Zimbardo. Okay, if you want to know really the in-depth knowledge of how a situation can take ordinary, everyday people and have them commit what would be atrocious acts, evil acts. I do recommend Zimbardo's book, The Lucifer Effect, where he goes in and he talks about some pretty famous social psychological experiments, such as the Stanford prison studies and the Milgram's electric shock studies. And then he goes into depth into other research that shows that about at least 2/3 of why people hurt others is bound to the situation they're in. But I like his definition of evil, which is the exercise of power. And that's a key word, is power. Power in that you have the physical and psychological and social means to intentionally harm someone psychologically, hurt someone physically, or destroy someone morally. And if we think about this, we can look at it from broad range, because this is what we do when we're in a warring country, for example, or even on a individual level. If we look at all of these are the terrors that a domestic abuser puts on their victims. This is the type of terror we see between gangs that are warring and factioning. And so this definition is very broad, but keep in mind that It's about psychological and moral destruction as well as physical destruction. And we'll really talk about this, especially when we get into psychopathology and what it is, because it definitely is a psychological mind trip as well as a moral mind trip. So let's talk about the reasons why individuals commit homicide. Now, what we're talking about here is not, again, what you would think of as the Dahmers. This isn't the Wayne Gacy's in the world. This is situations in which a person decides to intentionally harm someone physically. Usually it includes psychological and moral harm as well, to the point that it leads to death, okay? And really, there's been some reasons that have been proposed. For example, threat, for example, has been shown as a reason for things like gang homicide. Most domestic homicides fall under the notion of crimes of passion, where the person loses complete control of their faculties and then goes forward and hurts others. Psychopathology, which we will talk about in a little while. And I just want to differentiate the difference between psychopathology and what we see in other types of homicides, or the majority of homicides, because there is a difference between the two. There has been, if you've heard the news or watched the political games about our mass shootings, our homicides, are they a mental illness? What's the issue with guns? Is it a issue of guns? And I'd like to cover these two topics really quick, because when we have looked at homicides and specifically mass shootings in schools, we don't see in the majority of these what you would call a diagnosable mental disorder. And that's for the ones where it doesn't include suicide, or we look back on records. The majority of homicides don't include some type of clinically diagnosable mental illness. Mental illness is seen more as an issue of separating murderers from the community, and it's a lot of times used as kind of an excuse, in that we use a social definition of mental illness when we look at these cases, and we assume that there must be something wrong with them. There must be something in their brain that is dysfunctional. But unfortunately, when we take a closer look at it from a clinical perspective, there just isn't a lot of evidence for that. And in fact, there's more evidence for, again, the social, situational variables in most of these cases. And then, of course, there's a gun control debate. There is a direct association between gun ownership and the probability of being a victim of a homicide or someone who will commit a homicide. And so that direct association also is reinforced by research that shows that the presence of a gun increases aggression in individuals. So is there precedence for the idea that gun ownership in and of itself can be a causal variable of homicide? I wouldn't argue that it's a causal, but it's definitely a strong variable that, if controlled, would reduce the amount of homicides. And we can see this in examples such as Australia, where they had a mass shooting and the government did a buyback program on guns, and they've only had, and I believe it's been 25 plus years since they did that. And they've only had one mass shooting since. Now, keep in mind, before that, Australia had just as many mass shootings as the United States. But after that buyback program, they've only seen one in about the last 25 years. So that does suggest a strong association between gun ownership and homicide. Now, there is good news in all of this, because we do know that even though we are sensitized to the idea of mass shootings happening, we have these programs that protect us or help to interfere on this, and this isn't to diminish the issue of homicide, but homicide rates have actually been on the decrease for the last about 30 years. We've seen a steady decrease in it. In fact, statistically, despite what the news says, and despite that we do have a mass shooting problem here in the United States, statistically right now is the safest time in history to be alive. The probability of being murdered or harmed by someone other than a loved one is almost 5 times less today than it was 1990s and 1980s. So, but there is one type of homicide that, while we see all of them going down, there is one type of homicide that we see is on the increase, and that's infant homicide. For some reason, as we've seen decreases in adults and adolescents, we've seen an increase in the number of infants that are being eliminated here in the United States. Now, I'm just going to put out there, number-wise, adults are being are murdered at a much higher rate. What I'm talking about is an increase, while others are decreasing in rates. And there's 3 kind of theories that that are being kind of explored, and why infant homicides are on the increase. One is frustration theory. This theory suggests that due to the increasing demands of parenting, due to the increasing of single family households and not having the economic and social supports, that homicides are occurring out of frustration of the caregiver. Other theories suggest an unwanted burden theory, which is that the child was, let me rewind just for a minute. There's a different reason why people have children today than when they had children traditionally. If we looked 1900s, 1800s, 1700s, people had children because it was an economic benefit. That was usually the labor force on the farms and in the towns. And we see that, you know, clear up into the 1920s, before child labor laws, they were even the working force in a lot of our factories. And so children weren't necessarily born because of love or caring. And that doesn't mean it wasn't there, but it was mainly a economic exchange rather than a what we would consider today. Today, children are born out of what you would consider love, would consider want, would consider those types of things. And I lost my train of thought. And the unwanted burden theory suggests that the fact of the caretaking of the child is more of a burden than a necessity. All right, there we go. All right. All right. So the unwanted burden theory suggests that that the child was more than what the caregiver could handle, and therefore the infant was eliminated. And then the other theory on the increase of infant homicide is what's called neglected care theory, because a lot of these infants that have been murdered tended to have signs of severe neglect or abuse along with it. So these are the 3 main theories. I think the jury is still out on this issue. But if we do look at some examples, and I don't have Arizona on here, if we look at infant homicides and we look at places like Minnesota and Washington, we can see in Montana and Idaho, the rates for infant homicides are higher than the rates for other kinds of homicide. Where, for example, in Ukraine, homicide of adults far exceed homicides of infants. And this is just an example. If we look at male infants and male children, we can see 74 and 75 in this area. We have more adults, but starting in the 95s and 99s, and these statistics are actually increasing, not decreasing. So the recent ones from 2000, 2010 were just released and they're higher than this. We see that babies and infants and children are at a higher rate. And we see the same trend for females. As you can see here, the rates for adults haven't decreased as much, but as we can see, babies and infants and children, homicide rates have exceeded the 74, 78 rates. And why this is probably important is it was in the 70s and 80s that we saw the highest homicide rates here in the United States. And so these statistics kind of represent a peak level of homicides in the US. Fun with statistics. Okay. We do know that there is a correlation between the association between suicides and infant homicide. If you look at this blue line right here, this represents what's called a trend line. And we can see that there is an association between suicide and infant homicide. Why this is different is that, I'm going to go on to some other graphs here, is normally when we see homicides, when homicides are low, suicides are high. Okay, you see this trend, see up here, high homicide rates, low suicide rates. And on this side, we have low suicide rates, but we have high homicide rates. And this is based on age as well, okay? And we see this for both males and females, okay? So the normal trend is that when suicides are high, homicides are low, but that's not the same when we're talking about infant homicides, okay? So this is a trend right now, and something that we need to take into consideration, right? What is really driving these rates? I propose some ideas, but to be honest with you, social science doesn't know the answer right at the moment. We have all of these correlations, but this is the trend that we see right now. So I want to talk a little bit more about non-psychopathic adult homicides, okay? Just again, some numbers in the United States, greater than 50% are intimate partner homicides, or what we call family-side. So this is murders between two intimate partners or between family members. A little bit greater than 30% are intergroup conflicts. This would include things like gang violence, as an example, organized violence, those types of violence. This also includes a lot of in the statistics includes the mass shooting statistics that we've seen. So if you see the sensationalization of mass shootings here in the United States, remember that's still less than the number of intimate partners and family members that are being killed individually in the United States, okay? And right now, we're going to say that less than 9% are psychopathic murders. And as you'll see, there's a difference between someone who is psychopathic and someone who is not. So, but the thing that I want everyone to keep in mind at this point The majority of murders in the United States, again, greater than 90%, are not caused by the Dahmers and the Wayne Gacy's of the world. They're committed by people, and I'm going to make this blunt, like you and me. Okay. Just some other numbers about the United States. The United States has the highest homicide rate of the 26 modern countries. We average between 5 to 6 per 100,000. The other 26 nations average less than 1.7 per 100,000. The United States also has the highest incarceration rate of the 26 modern countries. In fact, if we want to go to another country that compares the incarceration rates in the United States, we'd have to look at North Korea, who slightly has a few more population-wise, but we're at about the same rate. And on a national level, some recent research has shown that the rates of homicides on the national level seems to be highly associated with the militarization of police forces and areas that are what we are called more individualistic, meaning what we have seen is over the years, taking base rates of homicide, that when police departments go from what's called community policing, that's where a police officer wears plain clothing, plain uniform clothing, isn't heavily armed, and then we look as they militarize and start wearing the heavy armor and the guns and all that, that militarization is then followed by an increase in homicides in that community. We also find that communities in the United States that are highly individualistic, meaning that individualism is the idea that I alone am responsible for my success and failures, and nothing else has that responsibility. So when someone does something wrong to me, it's because of them in an individualistic state of mind, okay? And I do have to mention, this does not include what's called state-sanctioned murders. This is when the state, for example, does the, what are they called? Lethal injection. Thank you. I'm not thinking all of a sudden. So when their states say these numbers do not include the number of people who are murdered for capitalist offenses, as you would say. So these are some of the trends that we see here in the United States. And again, this does not include our main topic of psychopathology, which we're going to talk about today. This is just kind of a view of what's the majority of homicides here in the United States. This just shows that when it comes to perpetrators, it's usually done by 2 or less individuals. And as you can see, the trend goes down as more and more individuals become involved with a murder, okay? And this graph is just the one that I was showing earlier, where there's an inverse relationship between suicides and homicides. And I should note that this does make sense, because earlier, as I said, homicide rates in the United States have been steadily going down for the last 20 or 30 years, but the rates of suicides have been steadily increasing over the last 20, 30 years. So it seems like, at least here in the United States, if we're not harming others, we're trying to harm ourselves. What are some community level variables? So we looked at the national level, and we saw things like militarization and individualism, those kind of more national or state level. What about when we get down to communities? What are the stronger predictors of homicide rates? And we find communities who are high in inequality, meaning that there's difference between ethnicities, difference between how genders are treated, and individuals are treated based on some measure such as skin color or the like. We see that that's associated with homicide rates, infant mortality rates, poverty index. The more poverty, the higher levels of homicides or association with homicides. And the two things that are most negatively associated with homicide are what's called developmental index and economic growth, meaning that as communities are developed and they become more and more developed and more economically stabilized, that's when we see a reduction in homicides. So the thing that I find interesting about this graph is we can see some very definite things that we can do as communities to reduce chances of homicides occurring in our community by addressing issues of inequality, addressing things of early childhood and prenatal care for mothers, and all of those issues on the infant mortality rate. And we saw the infant homicide rates earlier. We can address things like poverty and development and economic growth. And all of those combined, based on at least these associations, should reduce our homicide rate within that community. And these are all things that we can do. The other thing that I've always been interested in, because I hear it politically, immigration, those immigrants are the murderers, thieves, and everything of the community. But in all actuality, the more immigration we have, the less homicides we have. If we look at this immigration rates that was again recorded at the heights of homicides here in the United States, and this index right here, this negative number means that there's an inverse relation to immigration, meaning we have more people leaving the country than entering the country. And this immigration, the positive is we have more people coming into the country, okay? And if you look at these trend lines, as we bring people into the country, our violence goes down, it doesn't go up, which is kind of counter to a lot of political messages that have been sent in recent 10 years. So. The other thing that was mentioned earlier was infant mortality rates and issues dealing with parenting and infant homicide. And we've dug deeper into things like income equality and adolescent birth rates. And if we look at this, it's kind of interesting. And it's kind of interesting when we look at this, we have one of the highest birth rates of 15 to 19-year-olds and the largest below poverty rate when compared to these other countries. So when we look at the family level, we see that we have that homicides, and I'll show this in this next slide, homicides are directly associated with infants being born to women between the age of 15 to 19. If we look at this, and you can, again, if we were to do a trend line, it would go right through the middle here. If we look at right here, here is us in Arizona. And as we see, we have a very high rate of birth to young girls and our homicide rate. And yes, Arizona does have a higher than national rate of around 8 per 100,000. And we can see this direct association between young girls having children and homicide rate. And it goes back to those factors that we just talked about: inequality, poverty, and those issues that we just talked about, because this is the situation that children are born into. Now, I would stop at saying, well, it must be women's fault, because it's not. What I would say is that it's a community level issue that communities need to address. I'd also like to say, you know, issues of reproductive rights and everything will probably see these rates increase over the next couple decades, the more that women's reproductive rights are eliminated and we start to have children at much younger ages than this. According to this, our homicide rates will also increase as well. All right, so this is just kind of going into some of the things that we can do. I'm going to kind of skip this one for some of my classes in Social 101 and whatnot, because we kind of viewed them but for the context of this presentation, I'll make this available to whoever wants to take a look. But again, it looks at the neighborhood, family, and individual level. And again, it looks at those areas that we just looked at, such as poverty, low education, economic issues, family disruptions, and then the last category of racial composition. And again, that goes back to the inequality issues. All right. So as I mentioned, most homicides happen between individuals and family and intimate partners. And these are some trend lines that we've seen, that most homicides happen because of a family dispute or a wordy quarrel, or sometimes personal animosity between individuals. The interesting thing is that these first three have been on the decrease over the past several years. This blue line right here represents 2020. But we see that love affairs, cheating on your partner, has been on the steady increase since 2008. And if we think about what started in 2008 very specifically, we can think of things like Facebook, Instagram. Our lives became much more open and apparent and transparent. And so the infidelities became much more apparent. And the ability to have an affair also became more probable, because you're not just looking at people within a 6-block radius of you like we did before 2008. We're looking at people across the entire country, if not across the world. And so the increase to access and then the increase to social media is the best and main explanation for this increase due to love affairs. And I do want to spend just a couple minutes about intimate partner homicide, because it is probably the leading type of homicide here in the United States. In fact, most mass shootings actually occur out of an intimate partner homicide. Most mass shootings happen in a workplace where a lover or a husband, and I'm saying it, you know, on the male range because it is mostly males, have a quarrel with their intimate partner and they want to send a message, and so they go into the partner's workplace and are destructive there. But we also know that intimate partner homicide happens a lot in the home as well. Okay. So who engages in intimate partner homicide? Men engage in the behaviors much more than women. We have seen, and we're actually going to see this in serial killing, we have seen an increase in female offenders over the last couple of decades. We're going to see the same trend in serial killing, where the traditional blend of female serial killers was limited to 2 basic categories. But now we're seeing that they murder at the same kind of type and reasons that men murder and serial killing. So it is good just to note that we have seen that increase as well. We also know that LGBTQ communities are not immune to this type of evil. So far, when we look at research on LGBTQ, specifically here in the United States, I always recommend not to look at research before 2012, because before 2012, most research was funded by private public interest organizations. It wasn't until 2012 where the federal government started releasing research funds to investigate, what LGBT communities. And so that meant that the research could be done in an unbiased way and not pressured by the funding organization. And what we have found is that LGBTQ communities are at the same risk of domestic homicide, domestic violence, as are traditional binary or what's called cisgender relationships. So we're not seeing much difference in these communities. As far as intimate partner homicides, about 83% occur in the home. And this next statistic is important in many ways. 44% of females to 62% of males that were offenders were intoxicated at the time of the offense. What I think is significant about this is, one, intoxication is an issue, but two, it doesn't require someone to be intoxicated in order to kill their intimate partner. If you look at these rates, 62, that's about 2/3. That means 1/3 of males had no intoxicants in their body. If we look at females, 44% had a toxin in their body, but that meant 56% did not have any intoxication in their body. So while it is significant, if we reduced intoxication, it would decrease the number of intimate partner homicides overall, but it wouldn't eliminate them, because we see that perfectly sober intimate partners can engage in this type of behavior. Some assumptions: women kill because of victimization. This has been, if you watch any of the Lifetime shows and those types, that's the main message that is tried to send, that they were victims in the past, that they had childhood trauma, those types of things. But we found that while it's still significant, about 1/4 of women who killed their intimate partner because they were victimized, that means about 3/4 or 72% of women didn't have histories of intimate partner violence or victimization issues. Okay. Men kill out of jealousy and loss of control in a relationship. This actually lends out true. Greater than 86% of men kill for this reason. And on the other side of this, 68% had history of intimate partner violence. So again, while we can see the reverse, about 2/3 of men are already violently harming their partner when they murder. About 1/3, it's a moment of passion, as you would say. But we do see 86% of men do kill because of jealousy or loss of control or feelings of loss of control in their relationship. Okay. And this just highlights, this is the statistics which are on that last one. This is the same thing. So this is the weapon of choice. If we look at, and again, if we got rid of handguns, would it eliminate anything? But if you look at the difference in the numbers between the red line, this direction, other types of weapons versus the use of a firearm, definitely firearms have a definite impact within the home. We can ask at what age are individuals at risk. And so if we look at age of the wife offender to the age of the husband, men are at most risk between the age of 20 to about 65, women to be offenders between about 20 to 55. But again, when we look at the risk to women from husband offenders, the range is greatly increased from 20 to about 75, and from about 20 to about 80 for the victim. So the range is much larger. I've always wondered what this person over here that's 100 years old and has a wife at the age of 45. I've always wondered about some of these outliers. Just kind of an interesting thing. Or over here we have a wife who is in her 90s and her husband's in her 60s. Anyways, so those outliers are interesting. But when we look at risk, the age range shorten when it comes to homicide for men and lengthen when it comes to homicide for women. And this graph, again, just emphasizes the age risk of use of different type of weapons. So when we look at the probability of the solid line as a husband victim, the dotted line is the wife, we can see that women are at most risk for being killed with a gun, peaking at about the age of 30, men at about the age of 40. And we can see the trends in use of weapons. And I want to get to our main topic. So to kind of end this first section on just homicides here in the United States, and I know I've thrown a lot of statistics, but I just wanted to set us up for this other type of homicide, which we call serial killing, is I'll just end with this on this part. The scary part of this first analysis on homicide with focus on the United States is that individuals, when it comes to homicides, are more unsafe in their own homes than they are walking down the street among strangers. A person is 90% more likely to be killed by a family member or an intimate partner than they are by a stranger. So there's a lot to be said about the company we keep. And, you know, if we compare this to other countries, again, the interesting thing about us here in the United States is we tend to kill within. But when we look at homicides in other countries, the majority of homicides are done by people from different countries coming into a country and committing a homicide, where here in the United States, we kill those who are close to us. So on that happy note, let's talk about the other killers in the world. And I want to talk about what is called psychopathology and serial killers. And I just want to bring up one an issue of debate before we go on is, what is the actual rate of psychopaths and serial killers in the United States? And I will tell you, it really depends on the research that you look at. There are rates as low as 1.5%, and there's rates as high as 20 or more percent. In my work, the best estimate that I have from the collections of research that I've read is that psychopaths represent about 3 to 5% of our population. Not all of them are serial killers, but as we will see, most all serial killers are psychopathic. So in this conversation, we need to decide, okay, what is a psychopath? And what does it mean to be purely evil, okay? In the area of psychology, we have 4 basic tests for evilness, okay? Test 1 is they need to lack something we call theory of mind and what's called mentalizing ability. Theory of mind in human beings is something that develops between 24 to 36 months of development. It's where a child is able to look into the mirror and go, oh my gosh, that's me. But then they're also able to look at other people and realize that those other people have minds of their own. They have their own thoughts. They have their own feelings. And this is where we get into the idea of why, when we see somebody, we start to try and analyze and guess why they're doing that. That's why it's called theory of mind. The mentalizing system, the theory of mind system relies on two systems. One is the mentalizing system, and the other is what we call mirror neurons. Okay, mirror neurons is when you closely pay attention to an individual, the emotions and feelings that they're feeling in their brain, and the neurons that are firing in their brain start to fire in your brain. If you ever want to see this in action, when you're at a movie theater and maybe you're just not into the movie, look at an action scene. And when you start seeing people, when there's quick movement, everyone will move to the left or to the right, or people will shrug down and get out of the bullet's way. It's really fun to watch if you're not into the movie. But what's happening in this moment, and we've seen this in many studies, is that the neurons that were firing in that stunt person's brain when they were doing those stunts start to fire in the people who are viewing that action scene, the same neurons. It's the way we connect physically, really. It's the way we understand each other's physical being, both our emotions and our actions. Behind those mirror neurons are what's called the mentalizing system. The mentalizing system is a system that starts this thing of interpretation and telling us what's going on. Okay, test one. A person who is truly evil couldn't have this ability. Okay, test two, they would need to lack what's called empathy. Empathy is the ability to take on the emotions and feelings of other people and understand them. Test three, they would need to lack consciousness. Consciousness is the understanding that my action has influence on others. And test four, they would need to view others as objects rather than people. When we look at this test, looking at psychopaths, they tend to fail all four tests. There's approximately 16 tests for theory of mind. Most psychopaths who are in prison for serial killing fail those theory of mind tasks. When giving tests of empathy and consciousness, they tend to score really low. And when we hear them talk about people, they talk about them as objects to be consumed rather than objects to be understood. Okay. And so this is the person that we have. Are they purely evil? While the ones we've tested for serial killers, yes, I would agree with that assumption because they fail all four of these tests. Now, if you look in the literature for psychopathology in the recent 20 years, there's been this notion of the positive psychopath. That in a society, we generally need people who are psychopathic, because when we go and measure things like CEOs and major corporate owners, they tend to score high in what's called soft measures of psychopathology, meaning would you step on someone in order to be successful? And we find that CEOs and owners of companies tend to score very high in this type of psychopathology. But what I would argue is that's not actually psychopathology. That's getting it confused with another disorder called another issue called neuroticism, in what I see, that is there a positive psychopath? Probably not. If we actually look at the etiology and the description of a psychopath. Because again, a psychopath has the inability to have empathy, their inability to have theory of mind. That means they can't love somebody. They can't have what's called true love for someone. And when we look at individuals, including individuals like Adolf Hitler, individuals of CEOs, they all had the capacity to love. They had very loving relationships. And so even people like Adolf Hitler, who would be seen as the greatest psychopath in the world, didn't actually measure very high on scales of psychopathology. So one of the ways to measure psychopathology is what's called the Hare Psychopathology Checklist.
Power of attorney paper? The school called and they said that, remember that power of attorney that we filled out in gold during the summer? They said that expired and I need to turn something in by tomorrow.
The hair psychopathic checklist has been used since 1991, and it has been a very good predictor of whether someone is psychopathic. How the list works is they look on these 20 different variables, and they decide 0, is it present? 2, is it present in all domains of life? 1 would represent that it's present in at least 1 to 2 areas of life. So you could range it from 0 to 2. And the other thing that I should say about this is if we look through this, we might find areas where we get concerned about ourselves. For example, there's areas of my life I lack remorse. Sometimes I lie. Sometimes I'm very irresponsible and impulsive. But the difference between everyday people and people who are psychopathic is these occur in all domains of their life, and they occur consistently through the life cycle. So when using this checklist, it takes a lot of time to actually score these, because you have to go through all domains of an individual's life, their romantic relationships, family relationships, their individual relationships. And you have to look and see if it's a trend throughout their life that they have these things. So for example, lacking remorse and guilt means lacking remorse and guilt at the age of 10, 20, and 30, and lacking remorse in intimate relationships, family relationships, and work relationships. Okay, that's how you get a 1 or 2 on this scale. So the difficult part about this scale is, please keep in mind that this has to be in multiple domains of an individual's life, and it has to be consistent over the person's life cycle. And what do we find? Yes, all of us will probably score somewhere between 3 to 6. We all have a little bit of weirdness in us, okay? That's the message. When we get to 16 to 22, we start to see the majority of criminals. These are individuals that we talked about in the first slide, such as domestic homicides, such as theft, and other types of criminal behaviors. When we get to 26 to 29, we get a disorder called antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder is a personality disorder, meaning that it's a disposition within the individual, where they have a need to aggress towards society. They have a need to, they have a deep hatred for a specific group or a specific community. However, what differentiates antisocial personality and psychopaths are people with antisocial personality disorder can still have loving romantic relationships. They can still have things that they care about. They can still have things like remorse. They can still have things like empathy and theory of mind. I just brought up the notion Adolf Hitler scores a 27 on this scale. He would actually fit within this category. Okay. Psychopaths score greater than 30. If you look at the scale, it only goes up to 40. So we go to 30 to 40. And we find that individuals who are in this also fail those 4 tests that I just mentioned. Okay. We find that these tend to be the majority of serial killers. If we look at Dahmer, he scored a 35. If we look at Gacy, he scored a 33. If we look at all the other ones, they all range on the scale somewhere between 30 and 40. You'll note that not many get above 35. However, that's a very special place for a person to be. And the one of the last people we knew who scored above a 35 was the bug guy that drove the Beetle.
Yeah. I'm a high school music director.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember who it was. He did a bunch of murders in Florida and Utah and Washington.
Was it Ted Bundy?
Ted Bundy, yes. Ted Bundy. Thank you. Extra credit for that answer.
Yay.
Ted Bundy scored a 37. Okay. And so this is how this scale works, and it's very effective in predicting psychopathology. I would like to just make a note about antisocial personality disorder, is that it does tend to be a personality issue that develops out of social development early into childhood. We see that the majority of adults with antisocial personality disorder had what's called attachment disorders in infancy and early childhood. Attachment disorder is when a child didn't appropriately attach with their primary caregivers. So they either act out against that caregiver, or that they're over clingy and cannot do things on their own. They're always looking for constant approval from that caregiver, or they act out aggressively towards that caregiver. We find that if attachment disorder does not get treated by about the age of 8, it results in something called adolescent conduct disorder. At the age of 8, if that's not treated, it's going to become a lifelong struggle. It's going to become a lifelong issue for that child. That conduct disorder that lasts through late childhood into adolescence, then more than likely, if not managed correctly, will then result in antisocial personality disorder into adulthood. So I bring this up because we want to see that developmental trend, and we're going to see this developmental trend with psychopaths as well. That they tend to be born to people who frankly didn't want them in the first place, and in a lot of cases did everything they could to abort that child, almost going to the level of a legal abortion to try and get rid of that child before it was even born. And so we're going to see this developmental pattern with psychopaths. It's just going to be amped up to a different level of complete unwantedness. So let's talk about some of the things that we know about psychopaths. On a neurological level, we know that there's dysfunction in what's called the paralimbic system. Whenever I'm willing to bet that everybody on this Zoom call and everybody in this room at one point in your life wanted to slap somebody, right? You just wanted in some cases, you just wanted to knock them across the face. I bet you we have all had that impulse. But what makes it so we don't do that? Okay, the issue comes to our relationship between our lower limbic system and our higher cortical areas of our brain, specifically an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is kind of like the executive of our brain system. They're there to say, I approve of that, or I don't approve of that. One of the issues with our neurological system, though, is that system lags behind our limbic system. Most all sensations first go to the limbic system, and the limbic system is responsible for emotional responses. And so sometimes we get this emotional response first. Oh, I want to slap them. And then a few minutes later, we decide not to, because what has happened is your body was preparing to harm that person. And then that information was going up to the cortical area. The time lag between responding and cortical response tends to be a fraction of a second up to 2 seconds. It can take for that information to get to the conscious areas of your brain. And then what happens is your prefrontal cortex sent an inhibitory impulse down to the limbic system saying, no, don't do that. That would be a dumb idea. What we have found upon examination of a lot of serial killers who also scored high in psychopathology is that area of the brain, that tract that runs from the prefrontal cortex down to the limbic, that makes that impulse response, is lacking in psychopaths. It's not there. It's almost non-existent. Okay. And so on a neurological level, we know that they have that impulse issue, that they don't have that track that runs between the higher areas of the brain that would allow them to control aggressive impulses. The other thing that's not listed on here is I mentioned the mirror neurons. The mirror neuroning system in psychopaths tends to be less active. It's harder for them to engage in that type of behavior, okay? Developmentally, we mentioned that they lack theory of mind. Where does this lack come from? We think it comes from inappropriate development between the infant and their caregiver. I mentioned just a minute ago that one of the issues that we see with the majority of psychopathic serial killers is that they had a parent who didn't want them. In fact, when they were born, and the nurse said, "Hey, do you want to hold your infant?" They said, "No, take it away. I don't want to be around it." In the majority of cases to children that we know what the parenting experience was like. If you look at Dahmer's situation, while the father did try to provide him with some type of stability, he was constantly being rejected from his mother, who did have a mental disorder, which is called schizoaffective disorder, which created a lot of her delusional thinking and her delusional thought. And she did not want Dahmer. She wanted only his younger brother and completely rejected Dahmer. For those who are watching that series. The other question is does psychopath, children, and antisocial person, does psychopathology meet the definition of mental illness? The truth is psychopathology does not meet the definition for mental illness. To be a mental disorder, it has to disrupt or have some type of negative effect on the individual. Psychopaths don't see anything wrong with themselves. People who have conduct disorders, antisocial personality disorders, do realize the things that they have done wrong and why they did them. That's something that lacks in psychopathology. That inability to see the impact on the individual disqualifies psychopathology from being considered a mental illness. And the issue of can a psychopath be treated? In the recent about 7 years, I've seen some research articles on individuals who have been trying to treat psychopathology, and they keep coming up with recommendations. But to date, I still haven't found a study that has been replicated and has shown that same results that initial research has shown. As you know, in science, that's the hallmark of science, is being able to repeat and get the same result. And we haven't in the last 7 years, since a lot of clinical people have tried to take this on, we have not seen a successful replicated treatment for psychopaths. What we do know from the majority of research that has been replicated is that psychopaths are a bad idea for treatment, because what we find is that psychopaths are learning ways of acting that make them better psychopaths. We find that psychopaths in treatment groups, such as domestic violence offender groups, it actually makes the other participants in the group worse, more violent, and more at risk to the people that they could harm. So from the traditional research that has been replicated, we found that treatment tends to make psychopaths worse. And we find that in the group setting, it actually makes the entire group less treatable and not just the psychopath. All right, so that's psychopathology. What is serial killing? What is a serial killer? And for this, we're going to use the basic definition proposed by the FBI. So this is how the FBI defines serial killings, and they defined it in 3 criteria. One is a kill in 3 or more separate events at 3 or more separate locations, and engage in what's called an emotional cooling off period between murders. Okay, so this is a situation, we have a killing, and then we have a period of time where the individual they go through what's called cooling, and then they kill again. And I'm going to explain this a little bit more here in just a minute, but I want to look at some of the global trends of serial killings. If we look at this graph right here, this is graph for the United States, and we look at serial killings versus other rates of murder. We see that 1795s up to the 1900s, and the 1900s to 1924, serial killings were fairly rare. They were still higher than an average rate, or what you would expect for a rate. But what happens here in about 1925 is we see the rates constantly increase, and they become almost a little bit out of control. And so we have to sit here and question, as anthropologists, as sociologists, what was happening in the 1920s that all of a sudden we have these serial killers running rampant in the United States. Any guesses?
Wall Street crash.
Wall Street crash. Okay. If we look at it, there was a big economic change when we look at between 1900 to 1925. Here we have a change in economy. As was mentioned here, we had the Great Depression with the crash. But a lot of sociologists and anthropologists who look at this think that it has more to do with industrialization and urbanization of our communities, putting people closer together in more compact locations, changing the way people work and interact with each other. If you think about pre-1900s, we worked collectively in a sense. We all produced something on farmlands or the like, and then we went to a market where there was this common camaraderie. I have what you need, you have what I need, and we have this. In the start of the Industrial Revolution, there's a disconnect between the producer and the seller. There is no connection. We buy things through financial markets now. And if we look at our modern time, we don't even know who makes our product anymore. And many of the sociologists that have looked at this say it is that disconnect between the individual and their world that has created this large increase in serial killings starting around the 1920s. Another interesting issue, if we look at serial killings and psychopathology on a world level, it's new to some societies. We know that from what studies we can do here in the United States, that pre-colonialism, there is no evidence of psychopathology or serial killing. When we look at Eastern countries, such as Japan and China and Vietnam and those regions, they didn't start to see serial killers until the Western invasions of Western society. And in fact, in some Asian countries, the first serial killer started to appear in the late 80s and into the early 90s, when those countries were really coming to a westernized educational system. So there's two things. There's our economic system on a global level, but there also is something about our Western culture that breeds psychopathology and serial killings. And unfortunately, just like a disease, we're diseasing other countries where this stuff never existed before. When we look at psychopathology and we look at why they murder, we can see that for non-psychopathic murderers, the reasons are kind of pretty even. It's either because of primary reactive, the person basically pissed me off, if you want to put it that way, or primarily instrumental. There was something I needed to get out of that person, okay? If we look at psychopaths, very few of them kill reactively. Very few of them kill in the moment of passion. Very few of them kill in that moment. The majority of it do it for very planned and methodical reasons, for very instrumental. They need something out of that person. When we look at typology of serial killers, we find that there's 4, and these are for men. So we'll look at men and then we'll look at women. Visionary serial killers feel impelled to commit murder by a vision or voices in their head. I will mention that this tends to be very rare, and it tends to be the impetus for many insane pleas. But what we find is that many times the voices in the head are due to some type of intoxication or drug that the individual takes. not necessarily due to some mental dysfunction within the person. We have mission-oriented killers. This is people who feel there's a mission in life to kill certain kinds of people. We see this a lot with serial killers who kill, for example, a straight person killing a gay person, or a white person killing a black person, and they do it in a methodical serial killing way. Hedonistic serial killers who kill for pure thrill and joy of it. They get a thrill out of it. They get an enjoyment out of it. Believe it or not, there's 2 times where a person will produce the most dopamine natural in the body. Dopamine is the feel-good neurotransmitter. It's what makes us feel really happy, and it's the reward neurotransmitter. And we find that people produce the highest levels of dopamine, 1, when they're having a sexual orgasm, or 2, when they're clocking someone across the face. That's when we produce dopamine at the highest rates naturally. What we have found with hedonistic serial killers is that they have an overactive dopamine system, that they even get much more of a thrill off of that murdering scenario. Power and control killers gain more satisfaction from the exercise of completing power over their victims, and sexual activity is almost always involved. These tend to be, again, individuals like Dahmer and Gacy and that other guy, I can't remember his name, Ted Bundy, tended to be this power and control category. Ted Bundy, I mentioned that he had a really high score in psychopathology because not only was he a power and control killer, he was also a hedonistic serial killer. He got a thrill and he loved what he did. Okay. When we look at the different types, and we look, for example, in Ted Bundy's, every serial killer also has a hallmark, a presentation. Ted Bundy only killed women who had long hair, and it was split down the center. And so it went to both sides. So if you're one of those women who have long hair and it's split down the center, you might want to rethink your hairdo. No, I'm just kidding. But the other things that Ted Bundy was also known for is he always transported a body. He always needed to control the scene. The weapons were planned. Very, very, in almost no cases was a stranger known to Ted Bundy. If we look at 2 types or 2 categories of serial killers, we find that there's 2 types. There's what's called organized and disorganized. And they use different weapons. Most of the time, disorganized serial killers use whatever is there available to them. When they're done with organized, when we're dealing with organized serial killers, we're usually dealing with someone who had a very methodical reason behind what they're doing. One thing that you should notice is that for serial killers, things like shooting is rare. Use of guns are very rare for serial killers. Why? Because serial killers get a thrill of feeling the life leave their victims. So they want their death to be up and personal. They want to feel the person die. And so this is another difference again, when we look at the number of people in the United States that are shot by their offender versus not, we can see that there is a differentiation between serial killers and non-serial killers. We can see the different categories, and I won't go through this. I can send it out to anyone who's interested. You could put your email address in the chat, and I'll be more than happy to send this. This just kind of goes over the tools of preference and the types of situations we tend to find with the different types of serial killers. And this is the same. So if you see up here on the top, this is a vision, mission, and this is the things that we tended to find most frequently at those crime scenes. But you can see that there is differences between these groups. So before we get to our activity, I do want to talk about female serial killers, because they do tend to be of a rare bunch. Even though, again, over the last 20 years, we've seen a steady increase in female serial killers, which I'll get to here in a minute. The key distinction between the majority of male and female serial killers is, though, that there are no female counterparts to the Bundys or Gacy's to whom sex or sexual violence is a part of the murder pattern. Now, again, I do have to make this note. This has changed over the last 20, 30 years. We have started to see female serial killers involve sex and sexual acts during their murder patterns. The other type of female serial killers are females tend to kill for instrumental reasons or for twisted notions of mercies. A lot of female serial killers tend to be nurses, and they tend to kill in order to end the suffering that they see in individuals. As I mentioned earlier, I worked with female offenders, and I was tasked with working with the worst of the worst. The reason why is they were having high acting out rates and high suicide rates of women who were in prison for things like such as murder and the like. The female serial killer that I worked with the most tended to have a bad habit of getting in a relationship with a man who tended to have a young boy, marry them, and then around the boy's age of 9, 10, or 11, all of a sudden she would burn down the house with the man and the boy in the house. She did this in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana over several decades. Now, what was she doing? This was an instrumental reason to kill. What she was doing is she was killing two birds with one stone. She hated men. She thought they were the evilest thing on this earth. And what she thought she was doing is she was allowing a boy to live out his boyhood, but then was eliminating two potential male violators by killing them both before the boy could go into full adulthood. So this was an instrumental reason for killing. I should also say that serial killers also have two faces. They tend to have their serial killing face, and then they have the face that they present to the world. In this case, if I ever had a question about the Bible, I would go to her. The reason I would go to her is she prays 3 times a day. She reads the Bible methodically. Before going to prison, when they were doing her sentencing and doing her pre-investigation, her church was surprised. She was the typical church mother. She was there at all events. She did the children's rooms. She was there to set up chairs for the church's events and help clean the church. She was a perfect church person. But behind that church person's veil was someone who was very disturbed, who had a nastiness about men, and saw herself as an instrument of God in order to eliminate them from the earth. And so that was one of the serial killers that I worked with. I should also mention that most female offenders and whatnot don't do it out of without provocation from someone else. So I'll tell one more story before we go on, because this tends to be the common route to female serial killers or female offenders. I worked with a female who molested young women between the age of 8 to 14. And specifically, they tended to be young girls that were her daughter's friends. Now, she was in prison, but how did this happen? How did this become such a thing in this person's life? Her story is most typical of most female sex offenders and female serial killers, is that she did have a drug problem. She had a methamphetamine problem, but she fell on hard times. So she went and asked her drug dealer, hey, what could I do in order to get a drug? And it started out with sex with her. And then one time the drug dealer asked for a picture of her daughter clothed in the beginning. The next time it was a picture of her daughter unclothed. The next time it was bring your daughter here. And in the beginning, it was her daughter just physically being there while the drug dealer masturbated in front of the girl. And then the girl was then eventually having sex with the drug dealer. And then one time the drug dealer asked, hey, mom, come be involved. Come be involved in this act. And so she did in order to get her drug. Okay. Now you can see the bad part of this, and I'm not going to say she was a great mother. We can't say that, but I want you to hear the manipulation. He did it over and over and over until one day he said, I just want to watch you with your daughter. Okay. And then what happened after that is then she offended without the need or the presence of her drug dealer or her methamphetamine. She became what she was molded into. And we have to say this about most female serial killers and most female sex offenders is they did not start out this way. They tended to always have a male influence that then influenced them into doing actions that they normally would not do until eventually they would do them on their own. All right. Real quickly, I want to get to our activity. So I just want to go through last 20, 30 years, what we have seen with trends with female serial killers. If you look at this list right here, the type, it looks very familiar because a lot of these tended to be the same as men. But what we have seen is the difference between men serial killers is there's a couple categories that differ. One is for comfort, the other is for as a disciple. Comfort is motivated by extreme material gains. I talked about the serial killer that I worked for. She married the men for comfort, but then murdered them later on. Others are disciples. When we think of disciples, we can think of some very easy ones, such as Charles Manson, the followers of Charles Manson. The women who were involved with that would be considered disciple serial killers. But we can see the similarities and the increase in different types of female serial killings. And again, we can chart them. And again, if anybody wants this presentation so you can take a closer look, we can see that there's a differentiation between how and what was used between each of these. Okay. And again, for females, we can put them in two categories, organized and disorganized. And we can see the same trend that we saw with males. We have seen, again, this is talking with both male and female serial killers and their notion with psychopathology, is we can see that there's 4 domains in life that tend to be affected. Interpersonal, we see superficial charm, grandiosity, lying, cunning, manipulation. And we can see affectiveness and lifestyle differences, such as parasitic lifestyles. Most people who have lived with a psychopath tend to be very drained after they leave. They're drained emotionally, financially, and psychologically, because individuals who are psychopathic drain everything out of people and then they just move on. I want to talk about this diathesis stress model, and then we'll get to our activity for today. I want to kind of go through the murder process. This was presented by Stephen Ganegelo, and it's called the diathesis stress model of serial killers. And what we start out with is biological predispositions, and we've talked about that prefrontal cortex damage, the arousal level, low arousal levels. And then we get into predisposition. Most serial killers, even though they have a sense of grandiosity, when we measure their self-esteem, they tend to have very low self-esteem. They have self-control problems. They have impulsive drives. And the majority of serial killers actually have sexual dysfunctions. They have a hard time getting into regular sexual relationships with appropriate sexual partners. And they have a hard time getting excited by that idea. All of these issues lead to what we call a maladaptive coping skill, which means we retreat into a fantasy world. Now, a lot of people do this when they're under stress. We retreat to a fantasy world. We think of something different. We go to a different place. The difference is that psychopaths go into what's called a dissociative process. A dissociative process is that they're unable to leave their fantasy world. In fact, their fantasy world becomes blended with their real world to where they feel they need to lead out that fantasy. and they're unable to recognize the difference between fantasy and reality. This leads to the first kill. Okay. Now here's the issue. When we talk about treatment and everything, by the time we get to the first kill, there's going to be a second kill, a third kill, a fourth kill until the person is stopped. We have found that when a person goes through this process, this stress model, that once the first kill is here, we no longer need fantasy. We no longer need low self-esteem or self-control issues. These biological issues are null. We can fix all of these. We can fix their self-esteem, their self-control, and their sexual dysfunction issues. We can help them get through their fantasy worlds. But all of that, despite all of those efforts, it does not prevent the second, third, and fourth kill. They're already there. It's already part of the person's life. Okay. And so in this, though, in the definition of serial killers, we mentioned the cooling period. And we saw this with Dahmer, we saw this with Gacy, we saw this with all our serial killers, as they would kill, and then there'd be a period of time when they didn't. And then we saw over time it accelerated, where the time between killings started to get shorter and shorter and shorter. What we have found happens is on that, for example, first kill, as long as they can keep that kill in their mind and keep reimagining, they won't kill again. It's when they start losing the memory of that kill and they go through that cool period that predicts the next kill. Okay, so some of the things that predict whether or not the time period in which someone will kill or not depends upon the crime scene. The longer the serial killer was there post-mortem predicts the next kill. The shorter time they spend there, the shorter the period is going to be between kills. Okay, for example, in the Yuma, Arizona area, there was it wasn't Yuma, in Arizona somewhere, that they had a series of rapes that included knocking girls unconscious and then taking them to a secluded place and raping them. And they felt that it had to do with the transient population because it happened along a rail where there happened to be a lot of transients coming in and out of California. And so they thought that this was an unconnected event. There were these series of rapes that they felt that they were done by different people. But then a rookie came along who just came out of training and said, no, I really think that this is a serial rapist. And they went back and they found some commonalities among all of the crime scenes. The biggest one was that there was post-mortem ejaculation at different locations within the room, meaning that the person who knocked these people unconscious while the person was unconscious, they would stay and they would continue to masturbate as long as they could before the person started to wake up. And we found that predicted when the next one was going to occur. It happened exactly almost every 90 days. Okay. And then they noticed another trend, that the time period the offender was there was getting shorter and shorter. And the time periods between rapes was getting shorter and shorter as well. Okay, this is an example of a serial killing cooling period. The longer they can keep what they did in their brain, the longer the period is between murders. Okay, so what is the typical serial killer? So this is kind of we tend to see that most serial killers tend to be white males, late 20s, early 30s. We know that serial killers tend to kill within their own race. The preferred method is strangulation or stabbing, the hands-on. They want to feel the life leave the individual. Victim selected, they share specific categories. So I mentioned Ted Bundy chose young women with long hairs that was parted down the middle. And we found this with all serial killers. If you looked at the show done on Dahmer, he had a very specific age group. that he stuck to, very specific type of male and male body he stuck to. We know that there's some subtypes of serial killers, such as sadistic and brutal crimes. These are tended to be what's called lust murderers. And they tend to commit in two type of ways, or two types of subtypes of serial killers. One are organized non-socials, others are disorganized asocials. Non-socials meaning that they have social skills, but they just don't use them, meaning that they hold jobs, they do those types of things. Asocials are people who have completely no social skills. Again, Dahmer would fit more in this disorganized asocial, but we can also see him in the organized one, as we will see in crime scenes. Organized non-socials tend to be indifferent to the well-being of others. They tend to be self-centered and narcissistic, manipulative and cunning. They tend to live away from their crime scene. And crime scenes tend to be controlled and methodological. The other thing that we see with organized non-social is that there tends to be both pre and post-mortem mutilation and torture. This is the type of serial killer I would not want to be murdered by, because they both want to torture you while you're alive, and they want to continue the torture after you're gone. There's tends to be evidence of necrophilia, returns to the crime scene often to look at the status of the investigation. They like to feel the outrage of the community. They get off on that kind of getting even with society idea. Disorganized asocials often are described as loners. They tend to be inexperienced in relationships, unable to socialize. Crimes tend to be committed in a frenzy manner. They tend to live close to the crime scene because he feels safe and secure in his own neighborhood. And weapons tend to be weapons of opportunity, demonstrating lack of plan. For these individuals, they like to kill quickly and then enter into post-mortem mutilation. They tend to not mutilate while the victim is still alive. Most common is biting and slashing of breasts and genitals for these individuals. We see insertion of foreign object, and as one person describing this, they tend to be inquisitive, like an inquisitive child with a new toy, and they want to explore how the body works. This again is the Dahmer type. He was curious about what made those young men operated. He wanted to explore their organs and explore what was going on. And they tend to return to the crime scene and often continue the mutilation process. In most cases, to the point that the victim is no longer recognizable. Some example of lust killers was James Russell Odom and James Clayton Lawson. The interesting thing about these two is they did meet in a mental institution, and they started planning their rapes and murders while they were in the institution. They often talked about their fantasies regarding women. Odom wanted to rape, Lawson wanted to mutilate. So their crime was kidnapping, rape, and brutal mutilation of women after they were released. And this is a quote from Lawson. "I wanted to cut her body so she would not look like a person, and destroy her so she would not exist. I did not rape that girl. I only wanted to destroy her." Okay, now that's a direct quote from Lawson about his, and if you can feel that hatred and that pure want to just destroy someone, that's the first component of psychopathic serial killers. The second is lacking all of those impulse control and the brain issues and the developmental issues that then would inhibit a person from doing this. All right, we have 15 minutes. So I want to do an activity of profiling, okay? Now, profiling has started in about the 1950s. It started with a person called the Mad Bomber, and he was, they couldn't catch this guy, and so it's the first time they called someone in to construct a profile, okay? And so some of the things that Brussels did say, he was white male, 40s, 50s, lives with an aunt or a sister, hates father, love mothers, and will wear double-breasted suits when apprehended. And indeed, the Mad Bomber was a white male. He was in his early 40s. He actually lived with his sister. He had a hate for his father, but a compassion for his mother. And yes, when he was apprehended, he was wearing a double-breasted suit. Based on this profile, this caught the FBI's interest and a lot of big city interest, and this ignited the profiling revolution, especially here in the United States, okay? So what components go into a profile? Well, most profilers separate two things: the signature from the modus operandi. The signature, something done to fulfill or satisfy the offender's emotional state. Okay, so something at that signature, something that was left or something that was taken, something that was done to the body that tells you about the rage or the system that the person is going through. Probably the more important thing is the modus operandi, which is used to do most of the profiling. And that is what is needed to complete the murder, complete the act, okay? And so when we're doing this profile, I want you to pay very close attention to the modus operandi. I want you to pay attention to what was done and come up with your mind in what would it take to do that, okay? Because from that, from looking at just the crime scene, we can see things like age, race, and motive very easily, okay? And you know, we can take this, if you remember, we talked about organized versus disorganized crime scenes. So we can see for people with organized tend to have a body is hidden, weapon is removed from the scene, appears to be well planned, the victim is specifically targeted, restraints are used, aggression takes place before death, okay? From this, disorganized, we can see the body not hidden, weapon is present, seems to be spontaneous. And aggression is usually post-mortem. Okay, what can we tell from this? Okay, well, we can tell in order to create that organized crime scene, the person must be average or above IQ. They have to be employed usually in some skilled field. They tend to be socially competent. They usually have to use alcohol in the commission of their crime to lower their inhibitions. They have to have some type of car or transportation to both hunt and do the crime scene. And they are obsessed with media coverage on their crime. Disorganized offenders, we can see usually are below average IQ, unstable employment, usually socially isolated, live close to a crime scene, probably were strictly disciplined as children and extremely anxious, okay? All right, so based on those two, what I want you to do is pay really close attention to this next crime scene. Don't cheat by Googling. Okay, you got to do this one on your own. And I want you to determine five qualities of this murder. I want you to determine the gender, the ethnicity, try to guess the occupation, if at any level, or is it a blue collar, white collar worker? Where are they in occupation? I want you to determine if maybe they have a disability. And then finally, I want you to decide what the signature is. What was the motive? Okay. Does everybody understand what we're going to do? I hope so. Okay. So I'm going to go through a series of crime scenes. I would suggest taking some notes if you really want to be involved in this activity. Keep in mind that these are the 5 things that we're going to determine just based upon analysis of the crime scene. And remember those things I said about disorganized and organized in determining these 5 qualities. Okay, so here we go. So the first killing we found in San Francisco, Mount Templess. So the major, just to give some thing about these murders, they tended to happen in a secluded area in the San Francisco area, and in a bunch of trails that are up in the hills and the mountains there in San Francisco. So the first person came along in August of 1979. Name was Edna Kane, 44 years old, found dead. She was face down in a kneeling position with a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. And there was no evidence of sexual assault and no robbery. Okay. So again, we have the age of the victim, how they were positioned, the gunshot. And at this point, we have no evidence of sexual assault and there was no robbery. In March of 1980, we find Barbara Schwartz, who is 23. However, this young lady was stabbed in the chest and she was naked in a kneeling position. Again, no signs of sexual assault. So here we have a younger lady. The choice of elimination was with a knife. And this one they did find was naked. In October 1980, we have Alan Alderson, who was 26, shot in the head. However, she was just found in a shallow grave. She was not naked and she was not kneeling, unlike the other 2 previous ones. So again, remember what I mentioned about intensity and the cooling periods. In November of 1980, we have Shauna May, who's 25. She was found in a grave next to Diana Connell, who was 22, who had been missing for 1 month. So here we have a situation in November of 1980 where we find one victim next to another who'd been missing for over a month, and both had been shot in the head. On the same day, 2 more bodies were found. Richard Stower was 19 years, and his fiancée was Cynthia Moreland, who was 18. Determined to have been killed in the same weekend as Ann Alderson in mid-October. Now we have a couple, right? Very young. In March of 1981, we find in Henry Cowell's Redwood State Park, Ellen Henson and Stephen Hurtle. He threatened, now here we have the element of rape. He threatened to rape Ellen, shot and killed her when she protested. Stephen was shot, but he was survived. He was able to give a basic description of the man. He looked large, stout was basically the description. So we know we have a large and stout guy. Okay, so based on these descriptions, if you need me to go back on any of the slides, let me know. But again, what I'd like you to do I have it? I want you to try and determine the gender, ethnicity, occupation, disability, and what you think the motive was. Okay, so I'm going to give You can put your answers in the chat box. But again, if you need me to go back on any of these, let me know. I'll give us about 3 minutes because I don't want to go over time and I want to respect everybody's time. So I'll give you about 2 minutes to 4:57.
So we're trying to determine one killer for all of the crimes?
So all of these crimes were committed by one killer, yes.
Okay.
And I'll review them again really quick so that they're in your mind. So again, we start in August of 79. We have a 44-year-old female, gunshot, face down, kneeling position. At this point, no evidence of sexual assault or robbery. Then in March of 1980, we find Barbara, who was stabbed in the chest. She was younger, 23. She was naked and kneeling in a position. But then just in October of 1980, we find Ann Alderson, who was shot in the head, but she was not naked and not kneeling. She was in a shallow grave. Okay. November 1980, we have Shauna May, who was 25. She was found in a shallow grave next to a person who had been missing for a month, who was 22. Both had been shot in the head. So we have different instruments being used. Same day, they found these two other bodies. One is male, one is female, 1918. Killed on the same day as Ann Alderson in mid-October. And then in 81, we see in a different park, Ellen Hinson and Stephen Hurdle. This was an attempted rape that when it failed, she was shot when protested. Stephen was shot, but he survived and provided a basic description of a large, stout man. Okay. All right, I'll give it 1 more minute and then I'll do 2 minutes to cover this. Okay, let's go through these. I apologize for the time, you guys. Okay, so let's go through. The profiler's name was John Douglas, and this was Douglas's analysis. Okay, first he went through the scene. So crime scenes in a secluded area, only accessible by foot. So one, the killer was comfortable in the area, probably a local. Victims attacked in a rear blitz style attack. Killer was probably asocial, not able to charm victims in conversation. Blitz style attack was the only way he could control the victims. Victims' age range and age and appearance. Killer didn't know victims. He is acting out of fantasy. Victims were white, so the killer is supposedly white. Able to evade police, so he had to be, physically fit, and so maybe low to mid 30s. Probably spent time in jail, possibly attempted rape, and he profiled him as probably a blue-collar worker. Okay. He did feel that he's probably very intelligent. Because of the way of the betting and whatnot, not random acts. And so this kind of goes to the intelligence. He probably lives away, of course, from the place. Probably has a history of wed betting, fire starting, and cruelty to animals. That is actually known as the serial killer triad. We find that most serial killers had bedwetting problems. They tended to set fires, and they tended to be very cruel to animals as children. He also felt that he probably did have a disability. He thought maybe it was a speech impediment because these were done in a secluded area. He didn't want to be seen, relied on overpowering the victim. So to this profiler, that indicates a disability, but unlikely a physical disability. So he thought maybe a speech impediment or developmental delay or something like that. Okay. So let's look at the actual offender and let's see how good you all did. Okay. The actual offender, his name was David Carpenter. He was called the Hillside murderer. He was a white male. Okay. His age was actually 50, so the profiler got that incorrect. He was a blue-collar industrial art teacher, so that denotes intelligence because of education, but his occupation was more in the industrial area. He did have a history of attacking women and served some jail time. He had a domineering and abusive mother. And he was a bedwetter and was cruel to animals as a child. And yes, he had a severe stutter. So how did we all do? I see Mercedes got really close. Not sure on the disability was hard to pick up motive. Lyle, you did pretty good too. Pretty close. Yeah, I think from doing this activity over and over, the main one that a lot of individuals get wrong is his age. Even the profiler got his age wrong. Good job, Anna. No, okay. All right, good job, everyone. So if you did good on that, maybe that's an occupation for you someday, okay? Yeah, I think on the disability one, that one was kind of a hard one to pick up on. So Carl, you got close with the age and the anger with women. Probably tonight, yeah, okay. Brain trauma, I mean, that usually is associated with severe stutter, so that's definitely a possibility. Good job on that one. Okay. All right, gang, I do want to respect your time, but I do want to end one thing. A lot of times we think that we're at most risk at this moment when it's dark and it's not light out, and that's when all the scary things come out. And probably for our ancestors, that was very true. Because that was the time that without our modern housings and our modern protection devices and all those, that we were most at risk at being eaten by other animals. But today we're most likely to be eaten by other human animals. And the truth is that this scene is fantasy. The true horror happens in this type of reality. The majority of murders happen between the times of 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. That's when the majority of murders happen, both intimate partner murders and what we see with psychopaths and serial killers. Now, why is it these times are so susceptible? Because it's when we're at our most least awareness of what's around us. Most of us don't think about in the morning walking out to our car and getting in our car and taking off. In the afternoon, we're paying attention to our day, not thinking about our surroundings. But these tend to be the most dangerous times of our life. Our most safe times are actually at night now. Our most dangerous times is when we're awake and when we're around other people. So, Lyle, you have your hand up.
Yes, I just had a question with how much a profiler makes salary.
So I'll tell you, Lyle, in the field of forensic psychology, good profilers, if they get in with the FBI, make I can't remember the federal scale, but they make well over $85,000 and above. But I will tell you, you know, the part of that is you have to get into the FBI. And that's a difficult part. Most forensic psychologists that I know who do profiling on the state or local level, that tends to not be their bread and butter. That's the thing that they really enjoy in their work. But for the majority of forensic work and profiling within forensic psychology, most of the bread and butter comes out of doing domestic violence evaluation and child custody evaluations when there's violence in the family. And so that's where the bread and butter is for non kind of FBI profilers. And then occasionally they get the cases that are requested by local law enforcements to profile. On the state level, there's opportunities, but they're very difficult to get into because you usually have to start kind of at that rookie level of police work and work your way up. So, but definitely if you have the credentials and the ability to work on the federal level with the FBI, or if you have super good credentials and are at the CIA level, you can also get really good jobs with those folks. Does that answer your question?
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I do want to end with that message. Remember, on Halloween, it's a great night. It's a night of fantasy and fun and enjoyment. But I did want to do this presentation to kind of highlight the real things that are kind of going on in this world. Do keep in mind serial killings represent maybe 2-3% of the number of murders that occur in the United States each month and each year. The majority are of either intergroup conflict, or they have to deal with family or intimate partners. And so kind of keep those kind of things in mind. But again, reality is that we're at most risk when our attention is at its least. So protect yourselves. Have a great rest of your day. And thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Hey, Dr. Peterson, I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, were you serious about the extra credit for guessing Ted Bundy?
The extra credit? Yeah, I can give some extra credit if you were close.
Yeah, because I guess that Ted Bundy, when you said, oh, he drove a Beetle.
Yeah. I can give you some extra credit for that because I was
All right.
totally couldn't think of it. So I'll give you some extra credit for that.
All right, thank you.